We don't want surplus necessarily. We want enough so we can spend it, because that avoids the 4-letter word of special assessment.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the HOA Simplified podcast. I'm your host, Neo, and today we're going to be diving into one of the most critical topics for HOA boards, which is reserve studies. Joining us today is Andrew Stoutenburg, Regional Executive Director at Reserve Advisors. Andrew is a professional engineer and also holds a reserve specialist designation, which is very important for reserve studies. So Andrew, thank you for joining us. And just to get started, give us a brief introduction about yourself and Reserve Advisors.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. A little bit about me. As you said, I'm a professional engineer, also hold my RS designation. Been at Reserve Advisors for 12, 13 years now. And like a lot of people, before you get into this industry, you don't know it exists and you don't understand the nuts and bolts of it. But I've been here long enough to not only learn what it is, but really get passionate about it.
Yeah.
I just love what I do. And as a company, been doing reserve studies a little over 30 years.
Right.
So it's what we focus on. It's what we do. And I think we do it extremely well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you joined Reserve Advisors back in 2013. Right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Could you tell us just how you got into reserve studies in the first place?
Yeah, so it's in essence almost by accident, which is a fun reality of this industry. When I meet anyone in the industry, I like to understand how they got into it, and there's a lot of that. And so in all honesty, I right out of college was using my degree doing road, heavy highway construction, doing field engineering for that. And at that point said, I want to look at what else is out there, and literally just looking around, trying to find something that was in a market I wanted to be in, and they wanted an engineer. And so I found this. And the story I tell everyone is back then, John and Ted, the founders, were still doing interviews and things of that nature. And they asked a question, something like, how did you know about a reserve study, or what do you know? And I said, well, last night I went to Starbucks and I learned what reserve studies are, because that's the reality. And we're going to get into this. It's obviously a really important thing, right? It's really critical in this industry for these community associations, but realistically, until you're in this industry, you really don't know about it. And so it was what I would call a happy accident, because obviously I like it. I'm still doing this. So yeah, it was by accident, though, is the short answer.
Yeah. And we deal with a lot of, self-managed HOAs, and some self-managed HOAs don't even know reserve studies, right? And they're a part of an HOA, and they really should know what a reserve study is and the importance of it. But I guess that's what we're really here to do. So just to kind of set the foundation here for the folks that may be not too sure what a reserve study is and what the key components are, Andrew, give us a rundown.
Yeah, and you're correct. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know what it is, or they're confused. Maybe they have a little bit of an understanding. There's a couple ways we can describe it. So I'm going to try to attack this in a few different ways and hopefully not take too long. I'm notorious with nice long answers. If we think about this thing called a reserve study, lots of times if you Google it, you'll see statements like, well, there's two parts. There's a physical evaluation and a financial analysis, which is true. And what it is it's putting together a capital expenditure plan that's typically over a 30-year lifespan. And that's a great way to describe it. But I'll go into a little more detail on those. But we can also sort of take a step back and very generally say, well, what is it that we're doing? What we're doing is, for any community, they have to maintain a certain amount of assets. Legally, that is one of their responsibilities. So the reserve study is telling that board or that community, based on these assets that you need to maintain, here's how much you're going to spend over the long term. And because we think you're going to spend this much, and some of those are really big dollars, you need, as a community, to save every single year towards this. And the reserve study is saying, well, what are those costs going to be? And therefore, what do we need to save each year, right? So that's like a very general, non-standard way to describe what it is. But I think that I like to sort of just knock it into all the terminology and jargon and just get that foundational understanding of that's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to have that money set aside so we can timely execute the projects.
Yeah.
A tiny bit more detail on it, right? So the physical evaluation, you have someone, typically a reserve specialist or similar, coming to a property to visually assess your components, because that individual has to say, well, how much life is left and what is it going to cost? How big or small is this asset? And that's part of that physical evaluation, mapping out those expenditures. And then the financial analysis based on what that capital expenditure plan is saying. How do we stay cash positive? How do we just not run out of money? And it's sort of a funny way to describe it, but that's literally what we're doing. We're saying we want enough. We don't want surplus necessarily. We want enough so we can spend it, because that avoids the 4-letter word of special assessment. And if you're properly funding, you're doing everything you can as a board to minimize that risk of special assessment. So sort of in a nutshell, how I like to describe reserve studies. And again, we can get into more detail as needed.
Yeah, perfect. No, I think that was great. And rather than getting into like type 1, and we will get into it, I think that's kind of my next question, right? There's 3 types in a reserve study. I know in California with Davis Sterling, you have to do a type 1 every 3 years, but depending on the state, some state has no legislations on reserve studies. I honestly think the Davis Sterling Act really does help associations, just because having that 3-year limit allows HOAs to just really stay proactive in managing their finances and making sure that all aspects of their community is covered and the lifespan is being tracked. But kind of backing out from that a little bit, what is the different types in a reserve study for the board members that don't know?
Yeah, so really, as you said, there's 3 levels. There's a level 1, 2, and 3. The level 1 is what's called a full reserve study. In essence, think of that as from scratch. A reserve specialist doesn't really have any information about the property. It's the first time that company, at least, has ever visited that site and develops a complete full reserve study.
Right.
Then you move into level 2, which is a reserve study update with site visit. And how I always describe this to anyone who's asking is, you want to view that it's almost the same as a level 1. Really, the key difference is I don't have to remeasure. You're not quantifying that. That is really the big difference, because I'm not going to list everything that's the same, but think of it, you still are at the property. You're still doing that physical evaluation. You just already know how many linear feet of fence do you have, or how big is the clubhouse. You already have the quantities. Everything else, it looks identical to that level 1. Then we get down to a level 3, which is a reserve study update without site visit, or with no site visit. And there's some general terminology. Some people call it a desktop update or a numbers update. And it's what those sort of sound like. There's no reserve specials coming back to the site. It's really about massaging those numbers. Let's use California as the example, because you raised some great points. And I do think it's very helpful, because every year those boards are having a reserve specialist evaluate their property, either with a 1 or a 2, and then in the in-between years, a level 3. So you're really only looking at a 12-month window of what has or hasn't occurred. Did the plan we lay out actually occur? Did you spend more or less? When I say massaging, that may sound, adjusting the numbers to what actually occurred, not like, making it look more favorable. And that's what the level 3 is. So you do those adjustments, you rerun the funding. And I'll sort of go back to what you mentioned. I think you used the word proactive. And so in a regulated state, the beauty of this is that very regular look at reserves, look at what actually did or didn't occur, and retooling the financial plan. That is so helpful for communities and for these boards to make these decisions, because in a lot of the states we work in, there's, in essence, no regulation. And one of the things I preach all the time is the reality will always diverge from the plan. No one can forecast perfectly. And the more time that goes on, the more that divergence is, and that course correction becomes more intense. So then you go back to a regulated state where they're looking at this every 12 months. It is way easier for a board to make the right financial decisions to protect their entire community when they're looking at it every single year. So sort of hit a couple things there, but I think it all ties together nicely in my mind.
No, absolutely. And what I always tell, self-managed communities is, hey, look, being self-managed, props to you, right? If you're able to do it, that's great. But honestly, unless you have a CPA, a reserve study specialist, a lawyer, and a community manager all in the same board, I don't recommend you do it, right? Because I mean, it's very difficult to track, the big things and the little things in a community, and especially with something like reserve studies. If you take I'm sure you're extremely more familiar than I am, but when I take a look at those reports, it's extremely comprehensive, right? So boards really, it's just not possible for volunteer boards to get into that depth all on their own. And so I guess kind of leading into that question is, what are some of the key components, the biggest components in a reserve study?
Yeah. So that's a fun question because I can answer it in a few ways, because there obviously are the pretty typical, if you have this asset, it's going to be a big component.
Yeah.
But before I hit on those, I think it's worth, because you mentioned self-managed, and certainly we've seen pretty large communities self-managed, but we see, if we look at our data, more of the smaller communities are where even more are self-managed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's important for everyone to remember is, for your community, a boring asset, so to speak, could be your biggest asset, because maybe you don't have a lot. So the wood perimeter fence for a community could be driving their funding needs, because for them, they have 1,000, 1,500 feet, and they barely have any other assets. And so in their scenario, it's a critical asset, because if they mess up their forecasting on that fence, it could make or break their funding guidance. Right. Now, let's sort of zoom out. There are the obvious things. If you're a townhome type community, things like roofs, facades, balconies, that's going to be those big ticket items. If you're a single family home community and you have private infrastructure, it's a real quick, easy one. It's going to be your streets, everything about them, and even underneath the ground. I'm here in Texas, and we love perimeter walls. So actually, I use fencing as an example, but my goodness, we've got communities with miles and miles and miles of fencing and all different material types, but that actually ends up being a pretty sizable asset. And just sticking on the thought of maybe a smaller or simpler community, and the point you raised about it can be hard to be self-managed if you don't have all the expertise covered. As it relates to reserves, what we find is very often a smaller, simpler HOA, they understand that their streets are going to be expensive, right? And you know what? That is the most important asset. But what typically then happens is most of the other things get ignored. And while they're still not going to add up to the value of the roads, they still matter, and they still have to maintain them. And that's usually where a reserve study is extremely helpful, because of course we focus on that major asset or those few major assets, but we have to worry about everything. And that other stuff still matters to an extent. So that's the beauty in a reserve study, making sure you're covering everything you maintain as an association.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you mentioned that you're in Texas, but you work with a lot of the Western states in terms of HOAs. And I know, like I mentioned, California has Davis Sterling, Nevada has the RS licensed providers. They require a reserve study to be done by an RS. Other states have no regulation. So how does your team kind of, how does the approach differ based on what state you work with? Does it differ at all? Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the reality is the approach mostly doesn't differ.
Right.
Because we go back to when I said, very casually, what a reserve study is. A reserve specialist needs to come to your property, evaluate those assets, and give you a roadmap of when you need to spend money to capitally repair or replace them. So when we get into a regulated market, and if we actually ignore a couple of the newer regulated states, really what regulation meant was it required a certain level of study at a certain frequency, and potentially put some parameters on the calculation methods of funding. So until we get into those absolute weeds, our reserve specialists walking on a property in California versus in Texas, 99% of what they're doing is the exact same because it's the same scrutiny that we place that property under.
Yeah.
Where it begins to differ is actually not on the West Coast. It's down in Florida primarily, and then in the Northeast slightly, where they've specifically called out certain assets, and then there's some extra categorization that goes into it. I won't bore you with all that, but the short answer is it's pretty subtle how we actually have to approach it differently. We're giving that same level of effort more or less regardless of location.
Yeah. Okay, that's definitely interesting. I always thought there would be. I mean, I'm guessing though, in terms of when you're calculating the actual lifespan of the roof, right? If you're an HOA in Colorado, let's say you have snow, you have hail. So I'm guessing that lifespan kind of decreases, whereas in California, it's all sunny sunshine here, right? So I'm guessing the roof, and so those kind of nuances are there, but the overall approach to reserve studies is identical.
Yeah, you phrase it perfectly. That overall approach doesn't change, but absolutely the way we attack, think of concrete or even asphalt streets in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic with freeze-thaw cycles. We obviously have much shorter lifespans.
Right.
Whereas we come down to Texas, that concrete pavement is going to be really good for a really long time. And those are engineering terms right there that I'm using.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the specifics of how assets age, and then certainly the replacement cost is wildly different across markets. So that's where the differences come about, but not so much in the core of how is the reserve study put together,
right.
How do we run calculations. That's in essence the same.
Okay. And in terms of differences, right, in the long run, obviously inflation is going up right now. Inflation always goes up, and that's kind of an aspect that a lot of homeowners are concerned about. Right now, at least from what I know, a lot of the material costs are increasing, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas some other costs may not be increasing so much. So when you implement that inflation cost into your reserve studies, do you use an overall CPI, or is it more cater towards each of the sections? If that makes sense.
No, it makes absolute sense, because we've always talked a lot about inflation, and in the past 5 years, 6 years, now it's even more focused on. So a couple aspects to look at. Let's start with what you mentioned there at the end, CPI. And by the way, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to say this as well as others, but the CPI you view as a breadbasket of goods. That's actually more personal, how I'm going to personally feel cost changing. There's a lot of other indices that we actually look at more closely. Primarily, we're looking at a producer price index, which looks closer to the trades conducting the work and then the raw materials. But that nuance aside, of course, we're seeing how these costs are changing. And so that's where we're going to start. The next point I'm always going to make is of course, things are going to cost more tomorrow than they did today. No, I don't think anyone's going to argue me on that these days. So that's a reality. So we have to inflate future costs by some amount. The final point, I think my final point on this is you want to view our approach. You're going to review a reserve study. Since we're doing a 30-year forecast, we are going to be slow to react. So what does that mean? When right now, if we're seeing high inflationary rates, when I send you a reserve study, you're going to see an inflationary number I use, and your first reaction is going to be, that's low, Andrew. And then flip that. I'll explain it in a second, but flip it on the head. Go back to 06, 07, 08. Everyone knew inflation was in essence non-existent. It was very low. We're going to model a higher amount in our 30-year forecast. Why is that? Well, let's look over long-term averages. Remember, we're applying this for 30 years. So if we run at these really high numbers, compound that over 30 years, that's not what's going to happen, because when we look backwards in time over just a 3, a 5, and then a 10-year average, you see it smoothing out. So that's an important thing to realize. We're always going to be slow to react. But of course, we're doing our best to properly capture what the prices are doing. My final point on it, which is a great dad joke, is, if I was an expert in where these numbers were going to go, as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, you and I wouldn't be having it. You'd be a very rich man, right? And I I try to bring a little bit of humor in, because that's what I'll tell the board. And of course, I've had some frustrated boards that are, don't like the forecast that we put together, and trying to help them see, we're putting a forecast together. We're trying to send you in the right trajectory, the right direction. And so that's my long answer to inflation and how do we handle it.
Right. And it's a forecast, right? And really it is a forecast. So like you're predicting what it's going to be. And, obviously it's not perfect, but when you're setting up a higher number in terms of inflation, you're being more proactive in a sense. You'll have more funds. You'll have, if something were to go wrong, you're more prepared for that. And in terms of, some mistakes or risks that HOA boards are making, what are some of the few common ones? And I'm sure you see a lot. I see a little smirk there, but what are some of the common ones that just off the top of your head?
Yeah, the smirk comes in because the number that I'm going to say is, so we do thousands of studies a year.
Yeah.
80% of those studies are telling boards they're underfunded, right? So it's not, that's obviously bad. It's not funny. I'm not laughing at that, but to answer the question, it's boards continue to make bad decisions. And so I'll give some more framing to this. We go and work with clients, even in non-regulated markets. 3 years is the best practice of updating every 3 years. In non-regulated markets, we see it lengthen a bit between 4 and 5 years. And we go back to properties we worked with, and they're not following that funding guidance we established 3, 4, 5 years ago. And what did I say earlier? As reality diverges, it's going to be harder to course correct. So the number one answer is they're not following the funding, and it's only making the situation worse. That is absolutely the most common failing that I see. Let's flip to another perspective, which is sort of a weird one, but a mistake I've seen, not all the time, not at that frequency, but they did the right thing and got a reserve study. So that's awesome. That's not a mistake, but blindly following it. And so I've told this story for years now, but I personally was updating a study, and I walk in and they were so proud. And they told me, Andrew, we did every project exactly when you said to do it. And so, of course, to them, I'm not going to break the news. And I said, oh, that's great. You guys are really proactive. But I use this as a teaching moment because if I have an audience, I always ask, how many of you think I was actually exactly correct on every single project? I wasn't. So the story behind that, or the lesson is it's a forecast, as I keep saying, and it's really that first step. So when we line out, hey, here's what we think the next 5 years is going to have, it's the beginning. You may need to bring in other experts, get some other opinions to help fortify it or show you where you can accelerate or defer projects. So it's not all the time, but that's also sort of the other end of the spectrum of a mistake that we see. So that's a fun one.
So that this community so for example, you said 10 years on a roof and they just replaced it without having really.
Yeah. I mean, it was, hey, maybe that was my one perfect study that I'm ever going to issue in my whole life, but I'm a skeptic of that. So again, it could have been I was that amazingly right, but just the reality is it probably wasn't. So, both ends of the spectrums, let's not blindly follow it. But let's follow the funding, because it's going to set you up for success. Yeah,
let's get the inspection first before we replace it. But interesting. In terms of like technology improving and AI and all that, it's constantly developing. I'm sure it has some impact in the reserve study space as well. It definitely has an impact in the HOA space with the software that we use and the CRMs that we manage and whatnot. But how has technology really improved your accuracy and efficiency of providing these reserve studies?
Yeah, so I mean, without a doubt, if I think back, let's go when I first started, the first couple of years of how we collect data, how we did collect data to how we collect it now, how we are putting cost estimates together in terms of the volume of data we're leveraging. It's more, and in the world of data, more is going to be better. So generally speaking, it's certainly improving. What I think the core areas to think about, or to, I guess maybe for me to discuss, is we can look at that field side. How do we collect this information? And then, as I just said, in terms of costing and lifing, then how in the office we can sort of think, how are we processing that data? So on the field, what we've seen is, in essence, any geospatial, GIS information, Google Earth, satellite imagery, the ability to quantify assets and do it with higher level of precision in less time is increasing. And that's, I mean, in the last 18 months, the rate of increase of accuracy there and some of the products that are getting deployed that we're testing is amazing.
Wow.
When we think in the office, though, that's where there's even more opportunity. I would say as a company, we're still at the early stage in terms of how we're leveraging specifically AI and using data models to make more informed decisions. So one of the things we're doing that I'm really excited about is taking the mountain of information that we hold ourselves in terms of all the studies we've conducted and using that and training on that to guide when we produce new studies, having an AI model review what we're producing and give us some course corrections and some guidance to our engineers of maybe consider this route or consider that route. Obviously a little vague. I don't want to get like super specific here, but that's something I'm excited that we're exploring right now and we're already testing out. And what it comes back to is there's a benefit to everyone. So we're a business. So the benefit to us is we can be a bit more efficient with our time. But then the benefit to a client or an association is you can believe I have slightly more accurate forecasts and projections. And let's go back to the comment I made a minute ago is if people aren't following funding guidance, well, the better our cost estimates become, the more tight we can get with that funding guidance. So hopefully they can start to follow it a bit more and believe in it more because our confidence in our data is growing. So those are some of the ways that we're starting to explore how we're leveraging AI to really make more informed decisions that benefit us and the associations we work with.
Yeah. And I recently was in touch with a roofing vendor who's been using drones to do the inspections, right? So that's definitely something that a reserve study company can also implement. It's just these things that you wouldn't really imagine entering the HOA space starts to enter, and it gets fun and exciting. And also for the boards, it's also an opportunity where when the costs are increasing, maybe these new ways and technology and how it implements in the industry can actually cut costs for once.
And if I can, and this goes beyond reserve studies, but specific to drones, is that's really opened up a lot of benefits to communities. Now, I'm thinking more on the mid-high rise segment. This still applies everywhere, but when we think of how we historically had to do facade inspections, and to be clear, this could still apply to a 3-story townhome community, but the manpower and time it would take to visually inspect the entire facades versus what we can accomplish with drones. Same thing with just difficult to access areas. And again, what I'm speaking to really moves beyond reserve studies, but it's opening up a lot of opportunity for communities. And if it does things faster and at a cheaper cost and they can make more informed decisions, it's going to benefit those community associations.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking on kind of, saving money for the communities, when I know the kind of the industry standard funding level that an HOA should be is 70%, and around 10% of the budget should be, dedicated to reserves. What do you say to HOAs that really can't fit that gap, right? With HOAs that can't reach the 70%, that can't dedicate 10%. Or is there an answer to that, or is it more of like a long-term planning that they just have to abide by?
Yeah, that's such a big one. So the way that we approach it is, and the way I like to describe it, obviously, if you're younger in age as a community, you're going to, in general, have more time on your side. So it's easier to get on track. But let's make this a hard hypothetical, which is what we see day in, day out. Right. 1970s, 1980s, tons of deferred maintenance, barely any money in the reserve account. And therefore, they have a lot of near-term projects. So to your question of, it's hard for them to even consider getting to whatever level they need to be at. The reality is those assets don't care. That roof doesn't care, nor does it know, because it's a roof, that you have no money in the bank and it needs to be replaced. So you fill in the blank with whatever asset you want. So the hard advice I give every board is I describe that to them in a little bit more detail. And just our goal as a company is how do we help that board walk towards where they need to get? There's no silver bullet, because it comes down to, you have these assets, they have certain lifespans, and they have certain costs, and you're going to need to find the money to do it. The details there are, if you can't get reserve funding, regular reserve contributions where you need to, what you're really faced with is you then either are going to have to do special assessments at some point in time, or you're going to have to get a loan.
Yeah.
But all of those are just bridging the gap of, you're not changing the financial outflow that's necessary. Like nothing, when I say nothing changes, almost nothing changes it. The areas that a board can look is, they can look at, what can we move out of the reserve expenditure schedule so we can maybe have slightly reduced reserve funding. But remember, that doesn't mean that cost will never occur. It just means you're not including in your reserves. And this is where you get into state level. You have to know what you can and can't do. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The other thing that we certainly advise on is, let's stick with roofs. If it's $1 million roof system and it's almost at end of life, I say to every board, bring out a qualified either vendor you trust, or even an engineering firm, get that detailed roof assessment. And they may say, spend $50,000 in repairs. Look, $50,000 is a lot of Andrew's money, but if you're buying a couple years of $1 million roof, so now you're buying some time. So you can make decisions like that, but zooming out, really, you just have an unfortunate situation, and you're going to have to claw yourself out of it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a tough conversation that we have to have with boards a lot of times. And no, I never want to recommend a special assessment, let alone a loan, but sometimes it's just some, and also, raising HOA dues is important. And I come across HOA board members who are proud of the fact that they haven't raised dues in a long time. It's like, our dues have stayed the same. This is great. But, kind of diving deeper into that, what you're really looking at is, we know inflation is happening. Vendor costs have most likely gone up for you, as well as insurance. In California, insurance definitely increased. But if your dues are staying the same, then really, where are you coming up with this money, right?
That's a great point. And I mean, you phrase it how I always do, is there's pride in that. And look, I live in HOA. I understand the challenges a board is being faced with, but really, and I'm generalizing here, what we have seen is, for a community to keep dues stable, you are cutting from areas, because you said it, vendor costs go up, insurance, everything goes up. So we see a couple things happen. Usually a board starts reducing scope of services. So that beautiful landscape contractor, you start to take out some aspects of it. What's that going to do to the curb appeal of the community? But what hits close to home for us, where else does a lot of cutting happen? The reserve contribution. And so the moment we hear that, it's about educating, and we're trying to work with that board to gracefully explain that should not be a point of pride. And unfortunately, we need to help you as a board change that narrative for your community, so the community at large starts to understand this concept of HOA dues staying flat or going down is just not realistic, because in life, my cell phone bill has not gone down. It's only gone up, and my electric bill, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I totally get it, because the HOAs in the board members side of things, they're talking with the homeowners, and no homeowner wants their HOA dues to go up, right? Even being in the industry, if you live in an HOA, you don't want your HOA dues to go up. But, at the same time, the board has to make that difficult decision. That's why they're there. And understandably so, they're volunteers, and a lot of board members have full-time jobs and whatnot. But, it is a role that, should be taken with, not only respect, but with pride as well. And with that comes with something like raising dues. And it's just about education. And I think that's really why we're here. Do you guys ever, attend board meetings, or kind of help present things so that it is easier for the boards to kind of digest? Because I know a reserve study, report can be very daunting when you kind of just open up the first page and see the graphs.
Yeah, you're correct. It can be. And so, to cut to the chase, absolutely. To us, once a reserve study has been published, one of the most important steps in that process is our reserve specialists meeting with that board to increase that board's understanding and comfort level with that reserve study. That is That's really where a study is going to succeed or fail, right? We don't have to talk about, does the board like the funding? But they need to understand it. And it's a new product. And we can actually go up a level if you're not self-managed. This is even true at the management company level, because a professional community manager, very educated, knows what they're doing. Think about, they don't deal with a reserve study day in, day out. So even with them, so self-managed or not, this is such a critical step. And so it's really important to us as a company to make sure every board, we're trying to get them, take us up on, let us meet with you. It's virtual, just like this. It's so easy now.
Yeah.
But let's make sure you as a board understand it, because I like to tell a board, I'm not trying to make you the expert. I want you in your next board meeting, the moment you got that one homeowner who's stumping you, you should already be prepared to say, great question. I'm writing it down, and I'm going to go call Andrew, tomorrow, who did our reserve study, and we're going to get the answer. But hopefully I've educated that board some so they can answer a few of those questions, right? And what does that do? That builds a little bit of confidence with those homeowners when their board is able to somewhat articulate what the study is, why it says what it is. So that longer answer, but it's critical. That is a critical moment to educate a board.
Yeah. And for a lot of our small HOAs, especially self-managed HOAs or HOAs that come from a self-managed background, I think one of the first things that if they haven't done a reserve study in the past 3 years, that's one of the first things that we recommend, just because that also allows us to take a look at an overview of where their community is standing, what needs to be prioritized, right? And excellent point. Let's talk a little bit more about reserve advisors. This is kind of your time to show off a little bit about your firm. So, what communities, and I know you work with a lot of communities across the West, but what are some of the types of communities you typically work with? Condos, master plans, high rises, all of the above, and how does it kind of differ when you provide a reserve study for them?
Yeah. So it is all the above. I mean, because we can talk West, but I can talk, coast to coast. Mm-hmm. And of course, if we segment it, it's going to be slightly different percentages. But the bread and butter, let's zoom out, is we do reserve studies for community associations. We, of course, dabble with other types of entities, but we focus on community associations. And so we generally can segment that. We can call it a single family home HOA, a townhome or condo, and then mid high-rise structures. And it's not a perfect 25% of each, but we're doing all those day in and day out. So yes, who do we work with? In terms of how it differs, it's sort of going back to what I said earlier, at the core, it doesn't differ in terms of how we approach a community, but obviously a small, simple, tiny HOA just takes less time and energy to develop. And this big downtown high rise, it's going to take more time. It's going to be a more detailed study. So that's where you start to see it different. But our focus on finding the assets that you maintain, ensuring they're properly forecasted, that, at the core, that doesn't change. Typically, that high rise or even mid rise structure, a lot more involved board, a lot more involved management team, a lot more projects going on. So naturally more focus is applied to the reserve study. They're more engaged. And if you go simpler and simpler with a property, there's just less engagement because you may only have 10 assets. Yeah,
absolutely. And what really kind of sets you apart in terms of the depth that you go into in terms of technicals or being on the field, expertise of your team, anything?
Yeah, I really focus, and as a company, we focus now on the question you asked a couple moments ago. It's how do we make the boards understand, leverage, and use these reserve studies? And so our reserve specialists that they work with in the field, that's their liaison, that's their consultant. And so whenever those questions arise at any point in time, it's us making sure we make ourselves available to these boards because we know they're volunteers. We know they're not experts. That's where we're going to differentiate because, and the reason we're comfortable saying that is, well, we're built on a solid foundation. If we've done this 30 years, we have those data sets of good costs, good lifespans. We have good procedures of how to collect this data. And not that doesn't matter. All of that's critical, but there's a couple of big firms out there doing this. And I believe we all can do a great job on that data side. And I don't lean into saying that's where you're going to get the difference. It's how do you, once you get this product, how do you understand and implement and follow it? And how do we refine it as the years tick by? And that's by working with your reserve specialist as a true consultant to help you through that process.
Yeah, I really believe that that's the most important part. Even if you get a report, if you're not doing anything about it, what has the report done? Right. Of course, you have that. It's better than having no report, since you at least know, right? But you need to take that proactive step. Andrew, thank you so much. And just kind of, to wrap up, what would you say is the single most important piece of advice you'd give to an HOA that hasn't updated their reserve study in years?
I mean, it's an easy one. It's get the study updated. And I mean that genuinely. I tell every board, of course, I want to work with you. But if you're not working with us, my hope is I don't hear from you years down the road and you did nothing. So doing nothing is the worst thing. Yeah. So do something. And heck, if you're just going to make the numbers up yourself, it's still better than nothing. Yeah. So put a plan in place and try to follow it. That's my advice. Yeah. Yeah. Like with anything, let's do something, right? At least. That's right. Andrew, thank you again for joining us today, and for our viewers out there, you heard it here. Know your numbers. Make sure you invest in your future. This is your, most likely your biggest investment, and people like Andrew and I are here to protect it. And yeah, thank you, Andrew, so much. Thank you so much.